As a reminder, for more Microsoft Webcasts, you can visit Microsoft.com/webcasts. And again, I'd like to welcome everyone to today's Msdn Webcast, Visual C#, Soup to Nuts. Today's session is Part 19, C# and Windows Presentation Foundation. And now, without any further delay, I'm going to turn the floor over to today's presenter, William Steele.
Thank you, Tracy, and welcome everybody to today's webcast. This is C# Soup to Nuts, and today we are talking about C# and Windows Presentation Foundation, also known as WPF. Welcome back. I had a little a break last week, if you want to call it a break. My entire break consisted of not doing the webcast Monday. I continue to work throughout the rest of the week, but anyway, we'll work on one of these vacations one of these days. If you ever need to get a hold of me, you can actually contact me through my blog address. That's http://msdn.com/wsteele. And you can see that link right here. And better yet, let me just go ahead and click to the next slide, because the next slide actually brings up my blog in your live meeting window there. And if you take a look in that very first entry, the very latest entry at the top there, you'll see that there is the demo code for this session already attached to that. And if you just click on that session 19-C# and WPF.zip file, that will actually download right to your desktop. I'll give you a second to do that while you're doing that. You can also see out on my blog that all of the previous webcasts are out there and the demo code for them as well. And you can read up on some of the comments that people have posted out there. If at any time you need to get back to my blog, it's the same link that you just saw there, blogs.msdn.com/wsteele, and you can go ahead and click out to there and learn more about what I'm actually going to be doing. We're going to be changing this up a little bit. I'm going to be adding a whole lot more content to the blog coming up about our live events that we do, the msdnevents.com team. We go around the country doing live events, and this quarter we're actually going to be talking about card space, which is another portion of the .NET framework we're going to be looking at, as well as Ajax, Microsoft.com or Microsoft's ASP.NET Ajax libraries. We're going to be looking at the client-side libraries as well as some of the best practices you can use to make your Ajax-style applications safe and secure. All right, so let's move on. At this point, we're going to talk about what we're going to cover this session, and then we'll move into all those features. So what we're going to cover first off is what one of the components that WPF exists in, and that's the Microsoft.NET 3.0 framework. The Microsoft.NET 3.0 framework is basically an add-on to the 2.0 framework, and we'll see how this fits in once we move into this. We'll then move into talking about XAML and what is XAML. XAML is the Extensible Application Markup Language, and we'll see how it actually fits into the WPF, or Windows Presentation Foundation, lifecycle. We'll then look at the window object versus the page object, and we'll see how WPF actually allows us to target both Windows-based applications as well as web-based applications. And then we'll move into some more advanced things, though keeping it simple is traditional part of this series. We'll look at WPF controls and how the different types of controls can be used and what you can do with them. And then lastly, we'll finish it up by taking a quick sneak peek at the look and feel functionality within WPF to see how we can modify some minor and some major aspects of our controls or our pages or whatever we happen to be dealing with. All of this leads up into my next webcast series, which is WPF Soup to Nuts, by the way. I wanted to point that out, a little teaser. Today we only have an hour, so I can't cover very much. The next series, though, we will be breaking WPF down into its various components and taking a look at them the same way we do with C# in this series. So, starting off with the Microsoft.NET 3.0 framework. Basically, the .NET 3.0 framework isn't a rewrite. It isn't really anything, a version change typically like you're used to. In fact, it's actually built on top of the traditional Microsoft.NET 2.0 framework. However, it does add 4 core pillars, if you will, 4 sets of functionality. And the one that we're talking about today is Windows Presentation Foundation, or WPF. WPF allows us to actually build some very, very nice dynamic applications using a metadata driven approach, or a markup based approach, similar to the way you build an HTML page. However, WPF allows us to get at the core of the graphics engine in your computer to allow us to actually do some very, very advanced functionality that a technology like HTML simply can't touch. One of the other pillars is Windows Communication Foundation, which allows us to do it gives us a unified communication stack. So no matter what we're talking to, we break it down into a very simple message style scenario with a message and a response. And then we deal with the intricacies of how that message is sent outside of our application in configuration where it belongs. The third component is Windows Workflow Foundation. It's basically a mechanism for us to define workflows in an application without having to hard code them in the app. Instead, we describe it via metadata. And what this allows us to do is to pull out some of that code that all applications have and abstract it out into a metadata-driven scenario. And if you heard me talking about XAML, which we'll talk about on the next slide, you'll understand that both WCF and both WCF and WF all use XAML just like WPF does to describe what the objects is we're dealing. And the last pillar is Windows Card Space, which is our metadata or a meta identity system, which allows us to abstract out, if you will, identity systems, regardless of where they are, who actually supports them, but allows us to utilize a set of functionality that puts the users in control of what information gets presented to who and when. And this is a pretty big system just by itself. It's pretty important. And if you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend you go out to msdnevents.com and sign up for one of our upcoming sessions on that. Now, the .NET 3.0 framework is included with Windows Vista out of the box. However, it is an add-on to both Windows Server 2003 and Windows XP Service Pack 2 or greater. Those allow you to utilize some of the functionality within the .NET 3.0 framework, but not necessarily the full functionality that you would get with Windows Vista. For example, when we talk about WPF, some of the things that we're going to be missing when we move to when we install WPF on a Windows XP machine have to deal with the way that Windows Vista actually handles doing things like smoothing of surfaces and things like that, where those concepts simply don't exist in Windows XP. Windows Vista has them built in, and the .NET 3.0 framework and WPF specifically can actually take advantage of those if those features are there. So you don't actually miss anything. You just might miss a little bit of the polish, if you will. So let's go ahead and start talking about what XAML is. We talked about WPF, and WPF utilizes the markup language called XAML. XAML is actually an XML-based application markup language that allows us to describe a hierarchical set of objects pretty easily. Now, the nice thing is XML is great for describing hierarchical things, but what we're specifically describing here are hierarchical sets of .NET classes. So when we think of a user interface, we typically think of a hierarchical set of components. So we might start out with a page object, and inside that page we might have a text box or an image or something like that. And those can actually be described by nesting objects inside of other objects, and then we can extend that, because it is XML based, to include other attributes and other types of items that would be that would exist inside that. So the interesting thing about XAML is we use it in WPF here to describe what the user interface or user experience is going to look like. However, that isn't only what it's good for. It can describe any set of hierarchical objects. If you remember me talking about Windows Workflow earlier, Windows Workflow is basically a hierarchical set of business components, and the order in which they get executed is determined by the XAML. By the way, XAML, X-A-M-L, is the acronym there, and that's pronounced with rhyming with camel. So let's go ahead and take a look at what XAML looks like. Let's take a look at what it looks like and see how we can actually use it inside our app. And we're also going to learn about how we can actually get the .NET 3.0 framework on our machines and what kinds of requirements that you have here. So when I move to the next slide, it's going to bring up my view sharing demo, which is going to bring up my desktop basically. And my screen resolution is set to 1024 by 768. So if your screen resolution is set to that or higher, you'll be able to see my entire screen by pressing the F5 key. The F5 key will maximize the display so you can see my screen. And then when we're done with the view sharing demo, you can hit the F5 key again, and that will return you back to the normal live meeting window. Okay, so the first thing that I want to point out is there is a place you can go to learn about the .NET 3.0 framework. And here you can see the URL at the top. It's netfx3.com. This is our site to allow you guys to learn, and communicate and whatnot about the 3.0 framework. And you can see over here on the right-hand side, we actually have four different sections here, particular to each pillar of the .NET 3.0 framework. So we have WCF, WPF, Workflow, and CardSpace all inside here. To download the 3.0 framework on your Windows XP machine, just click on the Download the .NET 3.0 framework link right here. And what that'll do is that will bring you up to the standard download dialog box for the redistribution package. Now the only thing that you need is requirements. If you click on the system requirements, you'll see that you're going to need Windows Server 2003 with Service Pack 1 or Windows XP with Service Pack 2. It's already included with Windows Vista, as well as all of our future products here. You can see that. Now in addition to downloading this, and after you download this, you're going to want to go ahead and download some additional features. And those features are going to allow you to actually develop for the .NET 3.0 framework. And there's various ways you can do this. But the easiest way, if you're following this series, you're probably using C# Express or Visual Studio. You can simply download this link right here called Related Resources, and this brings up the Visual Studio 2005 extensions for the .NET framework, specifically around Windows Communication Foundation and Windows Presentation Foundation. There's another one available for Windows Workflow Foundation, and you can see that link separately. So when we click on that link, you'll see that'll take us right to, again, the download center for the extensions for Visual Studio that allow you to target this. Now, this is a pretty old extension set, November 2006. We will be coming out with later releases here, but everything you're seeing me do today, I'm actually doing with this exact build right here. So you shouldn't be losing out on anything. There is some differences in the way it's implemented on the various versions of Visual Studio. And I will point those out as we go along. In Visual Studio, the full version, you actually get a little bit more better designer surface than you do in Visual C# Express. But you'll be able to see, once we get into it, you'll see that everything is, you can still do pretty much everything in either one of the platforms. Okay, so let's pop over to Visual Studio. And in fact, I'm using C# Express. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a new project. And when I add those Visual Studio extensions, you see that I get a couple new project types here. The first one is a Windows application, and then it says WPF as opposed to a standard Windows app. And then right next to it, we get a XAML browser application. Now what this is it basically is a web-based version of the same application. And we're going to go ahead and create a Windows application to begin with, and we'll just call this C# and WPF. We'll go ahead and create the new Windows app. And what this will do is it'll create an empty application that will have a basic window object in it. And we're going to see that what it actually creates is a document containing XAML. And here you can see our Window 1 XAML document. It's brought that up, and you can see that we have a window as a base, the base node in our hierarchy here. And it also has the name of a class that actually is represented behind the scenes here. And if we click over, we can actually see that class. The namespace C# and WPF, and the actual class name is Window 1. And here you can see that we actually reference that class inside our window object here using the namespace.class method. There's a couple other references that are added here. Pretty much you'll never have to change these. These are just the way, this is the default that it uses. But it does show us a title here, and it does have some attributes that define the height and the width of this window. Now if I wanted to, I could go ahead and run this application just like it sits. And it's simply going to create an empty window for me with a height and the width of 300 and the title of C# and WPF. So this will take just a second to spin this up. But when it does, you'll see it creates a nice little empty window for me with our title and then the width and height of 300. And if I wanted to, I could change these attributes to whatever I wanted to. So let's make our heights maybe something like 500. And I can go ahead and start playing around and start adding other attributes inside here. So for example, add a few spaces there if we wanted to. Or, in fact, start adding some other items in here. So you'll see, because this is XAML based, it brings up IntelliSense, similar to the XML editors that we're used to, but the IntelliSense here is targeted directly towards XAML. So only the items that are allowable in XAML will show up here. So for example, I can put in a text block, and the text block is similar to a label control, if you will, and I can type in hello world. And then if I go ahead and run this again, you'll see that it will display the text hello world. Hello world, and then you can also see that the new height of my window is now 500, so I'm able to pretty much change this whenever I want to. One of the items that it put inside here by default was a grid object. This is if you're familiar with HTML, this is similar to a table or a set of div tags or something like that, where you can actually place controls inside an invisible formatting area, if you will. And we'll be discussing the grid control in great detail in my WPF Soup to Nuts series. But just know that in this, that you can define rows and columns, and then in each one of those, you can then insert items like text blocks or buttons and things like that inside each row and item column, each cell of that grid. To do a lot of things. But there's all kinds of other controls that we can actually add to this. So for example, if I wanted to place a button on the form, I can simply type click me, and in this case it's going to place the button inside this control, or inside the form. I haven't defined any size, I haven't defined any locations. I have defined that it contains the word click me, so you can see, because I didn't define it, it actually took up the entire area. And as I click on it, you can, I don't know if you can see that or not on the screen, but it actually does change the shade of it. If I hold that down, you should see the shade change, and when I let go, it comes back. So you can see it's a full-size button. So in this case, I might want to use a different style control. Instead of placing it in the grid, I might want to put it in a stack panel. And we're going to be talking about this in just a little bit, what these things are. So in this case, I'm putting a stack panel. I'm also going to go ahead and define a height of 200 pixels and a width of, let's make it 300 to make it fit the control. And then the text block, we'll go ahead and also set a height of maybe 25 and a width of, let's make it half of it. So again, if I go ahead and run this, what I wind up with is my hello world, and you'll notice that it only goes over halfway because I only specified that it goes over halfway. And then the click button actually is a little wider than my form because my form actually has, I would set it to 300, but I set the button at 300, but the button was offset from the edge here by a few pixels. So if I stretch this, you'll see that we automatically get the sizing. The window, the label here, hello world, actually changes in relation to the size of that, simply because I told it that that label control should always be half the size of the form. So it pretty much stays alignment. The alignment there moves it over to just half of that. And then my button size. So there's some examples that we can play around with, and we'll take a look at more about what's going on here. But let's take a step back and see what we have here. In this case, we're using a window. In the next section, I'm actually going to talk about taking this up a step. And it's, instead of just using a window-based application, we'll also take a look at how this same application can be used on the Internet. So let me pop back over here, and let me take a look at some of the questions in the queue here. Carl's asking, why is this better than using the normal form design and dragging controls from the toolbox? Actually, this isn't better. What I'm actually showing you is the controls that we have right now for building WPF. Inside of Visual Studio, if I was using the full version of Visual Studio, we actually do have a forms-based designer called Cider for building WPF-based applications. However, in the C# Express, that doesn't show up yet. When we actually get done, the next release of Visual Studio and all the other SKUs that correspond to that, we'll have a very nice graphics designer that will be very familiar to you, just like the Forms designer. But at this point, we don't have that. That hasn't been released yet. Hank is asking, what was the green dot in the title bar? The green dot in the title bar is actually an attribute of Live Meeting that just basically says that I'm actually presenting this to you guys. That goes away in the real when you're dealing with it. Oliver's asking, is there a tool to migrate your current projects to WPF? Actually, there is no tool. There really doesn't need to be a tool, if you will, because form-based apps and WPF apps can exist side by side. They really are, two sides of the same coin, if you will. So what you can actually do is you can progressively upgrade your applications and simply start adding WPF-based forms or WPF-based elements to your standard forms. And got a question here about when is the ETA for WPF soup to nuts. I think that is actually going to be in the July time frame. So that's what that looks like right now. Okay. So let's talk about Windows versus Pages. Traditionally, when we build a application, we have to make the decision whether we are going to target a desktop-based application or target a web-based application. The Internet gives us a very nice set of features when it comes to a wide consumption of an application. However, a Windows-based application gives us an entirely different set of features that allow us to get at the richness of what an application can bring to the table. The difference between the two, though, can be pretty drastic when you consider the different technologies that we use today to build an application. But with WPF, that basically goes away. Because in a WPF-based application, we can have the full richness of a desktop-based application, yet have the exact same deployment model as a web-based application, including the security model with a sandbox. But in WPF, we actually take that up a notch because we actually sandbox our application inside a sandbox that's already been provided for us. So we actually limit that even farther. But we still have the ability to take full advantage of, for example, the graphics processing capabilities that are present on the machine. Whereas in an HTML world, we can't really do that. I like to describe HTML in an interesting way. If you think about the way HTML works, HTML is designed for transporting text over a basic communications infrastructure. Now, but we don't actually use it for that anymore. We use it for so much more than that. For example, displaying images inside a web page is actually not a core set of functionality of HTML. What's interesting about it is there's a Band-Aid fix to HTML that allows it to actually work. Scripting languages, or data binding, or calling web services, or doing all of these other advanced things that HTML brings to the table is actually fixes on top of HTML for what HTML originally couldn't do. And the problem with that approach is that you wind up with different styles, different functionality, different ways of doing things to accomplish the same task, or accomplish different tasks for that matter. Whereas with WPF, it was basically a ground-up rewrite. We basically started fresh with a clean sheet and said, okay, what do we need to include all of this functionality in there, regardless of what the deployment model is, whether that's a Windows or a page-based model, or a Windows or a web-based model. So we actually built WPF with that in mind. So I can actually take a XAML document from a web page and actually load it up inside a browser and display that. Now, the browser does have to have some special requirements, and at this point, it's a Windows-only style scenario. However, with the advent of WPF-E, we have a limited set of functionality that allows us to actually to utilize XAML to actually display out, simplified applications, yet very complex from the point of view of what you can do today. But take advantage of a cross-platform portability present in a lot of systems today. So let's go ahead and pop back out to a demo here, and let's take a look at what the differences are between a Windows-based application and a page-based application, and see how we can actually utilize that inside our application. So in this case, I have my Windows-based application. Now what I'd like to do here is to go ahead and add a couple attributes here that's going to allow us to play around with this a little bit more. And I want to introduce a little bit of C# in here so that you guys get an understanding of the differences between C# dealing with Windows Forms and the way we're going to do it with WPF. So in this case, I have my stack panel, and what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to create a tag on here called a name. And this is simply going to name this item so that
Bill,
I can, yes?
I'm going to interrupt you for just a moment. We actually need you to go into your sharing.
Oh, how about that? There we go. Now you can see it okay, right?
Perfect.
Good, okay. So in this case, I just popped over to my code window here, and I just typed in this attribute, x:\name. And this name is basically the name that we're going to give this stack panel to allow me to add controls to it or reference it in my code. And we're just going to call this stack panel 1. And that's just going to allow me to reference this now from my code behind file, which we can see here. So double-clicking into the code behind file, I can simply go in now to my code and start grabbing a hold of things and start playing around with it. So underneath my initialized component, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create a button here. And we're just going to call this button B. And we're just going to go ahead and spin up the new button. And basically what I've just done is the exact same way we would have done it in C#. I've created a button for XAML. So here what I can do is I can go ahead and specify that this button actually contains, using the content tag, think of content as the text, if you will. So we're just going to say, hey, click me with an exclamation on it. And then I'm going to go ahead and set a couple attributes. We'll set a height property of 100 and a width property of 200. And I can then go ahead and take this button here and add it to that stack panel via code. Now to do that, what I need to do is I need to grab a hold of the stack panel that we had on our page up there. So to do that, I'm actually going to create a stack panel object here. We'll just call it S. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab the current stack panel that we had out there. Now that stack panel was an object on the page, and if you're familiar with HTML, you can actually go ahead and use a method very similar to the way JavaScript works called find name. And we're going to find an object called stack panel 1 because that's the name we gave it. And we're going to assign that to this object called S. So this S equals this find name stack panel 1. Now the problem with find name is it returns an object tag. So I actually need to coerce this into only returning a stack panel object using using this little set of code here by placing it, telling this basically in here, I'm telling it, hey, this is going to be a stack panel that returns, so I'm forcing it to return a stack panel as opposed to an object. So basically what I just did is I grabbed the stack panel off of the form and I called it S. And now I can go ahead and add my button, take that stack panel, and go ahead and in my code here, just go ahead and look at the children object here and go ahead and add a new child to the stack panel, and the object we're going to add is this button called B. So I just basically taken the same code here in the window constructor here, grabbed the stack panel, created a new button, set some attributes on the button, and then added it to the code. So if we go ahead and run this, we should get a new button on our form called click with a text called click me, and there you can see the new button, click me. Located beneath the other three because I added it below the others. I can also do one other thing here. I can go ahead and put a button click handler on here, and this is something that a lot of people aren't used to seeing yet. But I can go ahead and type in a button click handler to handle my button. Now, the button click handler is going to work a little bit differently. We're going to get the object tag, the sender object passed in as the first parameter. And as always, just like in C#, the rest of C#, we're going to get our event arguments. But I'm actually going to use a set of event arguments called routed event args. We don't have to. I could just pass in generic ones. But you'll see that once you start dealing with C# and WPF, that we're always going to be using the same kind of scenario here. So we're passing in these event args. I can then go ahead and start making things happen. For example, I can display a message box. So when somebody clicks that button, I can display a message box. Now I've got a couple options here. In this particular case here, I've created the button event handler, but I haven't wired up the button to it. And because the button doesn't exist in XAML here, actually this button does. If I wanted to, I could wire this one up to it as well. But this button that I just created is the one I want to actually fire the dialog box. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add a button handler to this using the click, if I could spell it correctly, using the click handler, simply by adding a new routed event handler. And you see it automatically filled that in for me. I'm just going to go ahead and copy this code, paste it there. That's the name. And there we now see that I've got my code and I have my event handler for this code. If I go ahead and save this and run it, I'll wind up with this click me button that when I click it displays the dialog box, you click me. Notice the top button doesn't do that because we haven't wired that up. Now if I wanted to, I could wire that top one up as well by simply saying click equals and then passing in that method name. So here from the XAML I'm doing the exact same thing. We'll go ahead and run that. So now when I click the top one, I get the you click me, and as well when I click the bottom one, I get the you click me. So in this case, I'm able to either call the event handler this method or call it from code. And in this case, you can see that when we're dealing with this, I'm actually dealing with the same exact type of object. I have a button in the .NET framework, a button object in the .NET framework, and I also can describe that exact same style button in XAML, and I can wire them up to the exact same event handlers and specify the same attributes that we saw, the content. Here you can see the content is in the middle here. If I wanted to, I could also specify it here. But hopefully that gives you a nice relationship between the actual C# code as well as the XAML code. Now, the demo was all about making this this code work in both the Windows world as well as the web world. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to save this project and I'm going to create a new one in the same solution. But in this time I'm actually going to use the XAML browser application, and we're just going to go ahead and just use the default name there. And that's going to create a new project, but it's going to be a web-based project. So instead of having the top-level object being a window, instead we actually have our top-level object as a page. But I'm just going to go ahead and go to the Windows code, and I'm going to copy the exact same code here, go to the page object, and I'm going to paste that right in there. And I'm going to go to the C# code, and I'm going to copy this code. We'll go over to our XAML C# page here, and we'll go ahead and paste that in there. And I need to do one other thing. Because I added that stack panel called S, I need to go ahead and add that there. So in this case, I've added the exact same code. I've just copied and pasted it between the two applications. If I go ahead and save this, and I set this as the default application, and go ahead and run this now, what we're going to get is it's going to launch inside of Internet Explorer. And we're going to see the exact same code executing. Literally, it's a cut and paste. The only difference between them is that the top-level object is a parent. The parent-level object is either a window or a page. Other than that, everything else should function identically. In fact, even the dialog box displaying in the browser, once this goes ahead and runs, you'll see that it's loading this thing called an XBAP, a XAML binary application. This is actually a compiled version of XAML, and that gets sent down to the client. And here you can see my hello world, my click me, and my click me. So I dynamically added this with code. If I click this, I get the You Click Me dialog box. Same thing with here. Plus I have my Hello World text. And again, if because we sized that the way this is, if I size the browser app, you'll see that the application reformats itself for the browser as well. So in this scenario here, we actually wind up with the exact same code in both the Windows-based world and the web-based world doing the exact same thing. Okay, so I've got a few questions in the queue here. Let me check this. Tim's asking about CTPs for Visual Studio can be difficult to update or replace when later versions are released. Do I anticipate any issues in this case? I personally never anticipate issues, so I'm not a good person to ask for that. I haven't had any as of yet. Is WPFE enhancement module on ActiveX control? That would be yes. Are the .NET 3.0 framework extensions for Visual Studio IDE made available in VS 2005 Service Pack 1, or is that a separate download? It is an entirely separate download. Those will be available once we actually ship Orcus as an embedded, but until then, it's actually a separate download. Mike is asking, what if FindName can't find an object with that name? If FindName can't find an object with that name, it's going to throw an exception. It should be able to find that. Actually, it might not throw an exception. It might simply just return a null object because that object doesn't exist. And what I do in my other demo, in my demo code, if you download it, you'll see I actually check to see after I do a find name on the object. I actually check to see if the object is null before I do anything with it. So those are some great questions. Okay, so let's talk about WPF controls. We saw a few controls earlier. I did the stack panel, which is the control. I did the text block. I did a button. There's several different types of controls, but there's basically only 4 classes of controls. There are only 4 types of controls, if you will. The first one is the content control, which is basically a control that's constrained to doing a single thing or a single item. For example, button control really doesn't do anything beyond being a button. However, there are types of controls that can contain other controls in individual item bases. So if you consider a list box is a control that can contain a whole bunch of individual items. Now what's interesting about those individual items is those individual items can actually be other item controls. So you can get some really complicated interactions with your applications by nesting these various types of controls. And we'll see, you'll see in WPF that some of these controls can actually become very advanced looking while still retaining the basics of being a list box or whatever other kind of control you were dealing with. The third type of control is what we call a range control, and this is a type of control that can basically store a value and then display that value in some way. For example, a progress bar will show you how far you are in a certain range, and by default the progress bar is from 0 to 100, and it will show you what value you've actually assigned to that progress bar. Say 50%, then the bar would show green halfway across the screen. Now the fourth type of control is a text is basically a control that allows you to edit text. Now what's interesting is I have text and ink here, and what this means is that in the text and ink, what we actually wind up with is a control that can actually use text from the keyboard, but optionally use text through some of the various other methods that you would add data to it. So for example, if I'm using a tablet PC, I can actually write into a text box, or I can annotate an image control, and I'll show you an example of that in just a second. In fact, let's go ahead and pop back into the examples here and take a look at some of the various types of controls that we can deal with when we're dealing with WPF. And at this point, back into the demo, I'll make sure I remember to do that. I'm just going to pop over to the XAML-based application in Windows and go ahead and start adding some of these things. So we saw the text blocks there with the hello world in it. We saw this button control, and I can actually move these around. I can play with them and do whatever I want to with them. So we'll put that button at the top there. I've got another control that we can add here, a list box. Now a list box is just that. It is a list box. It can contain items, and those items are actually what we call list box items. So a list box item is a type of container control that can actually contain other types of controls. So if I wanted to, I could add images inside the list box items, or I could add buttons inside the list box items. And I'm going to keep it simple here. We're just going to add some text blocks. Now, a text block is a non-editable block. So we'll just say hello 1 on this one. And to have multiple list box items, I'm just going to copy this and paste that and place a few more of these in here. So there I have a list box that contains individual list box items. I could name these independently using the x:name attribute, or I could name the entire list box. There's quite a few things that I can do here. In this case, this is an unbound list box. If I wanted to, I could even actually specify the source of this control, and that would allow me to bind this to other types of items. Say, for example, if I was dealing with a database and I wanted to do some data binding, I can actually supply the data through the data context in this. So the list box control, if we go ahead and run that, will show me a nice little list box in my page. Let's get this up here. And there you can see my list box. And you can see that that button down below there was added below that because that was added in code after I rendered it. But there's my list box. And the standard kinds of things that apply to list boxes. So for example, if I wanted to deal with having my list box actually respond to certain events, if you will, I can actually do that by simply specifying in my list box that we actually have an event handler. So in this case, the selection changed event handler. And we'll just go ahead and specify what the name of it is. We'll call it listbox changed. So then we'll drop over to our code and we'll go ahead and add another event handler for listbox change. In this case, the listbox change event handler is actually going to take a special kind of argument designed specifically for list boxes. So there's my sender. This kind of argument is actually going to be the selection changed event args here. We'll call that E. And then I can go ahead and have it do something here. In this case, I'm just going to check to see if we actually have items in here. If there are, if the count is greater than 0, in other words, are there items in this? Then we'll go ahead and display a message box. It actually says you just selected, and then we'll go ahead and display the item that's selected, which is actually going to be the element 0 that's passed into us. I guess it would help if I checked how many items were in it. If there was more than 0 items returned, then go ahead and display that. So in this case, if I go ahead and run that, so go ahead and bring this up in the web browser again. But this time when I select on each one of the items in the list box, it's going to display a dialog box telling me that I selected hello 1 or hello 3, depending on what I click on. Another type of control that we can add to that is range control. So the progress bar. The progress bar is one example of that. There are other types. In this case, we'll set a height. By the way, if you drop a progress bar on there without setting a height, you're actually going to wind up with something that you can't really see very well because the default height actually doesn't show any data in it. We'll just go ahead and give this a name while we're here. We'll call this progress bar 1. And then if I wanted to, I could just terminate this just like that. And you can see I now have a progress bar with a name called progress bar 1. What I'm going to do is in my button handler here, instead of doing the button click in this particular case, I'm actually going to go ahead and make it another button event handler here. Actually, let's just copy this code. Button, we'll call this button 2-click. And instead of doing where we actually were playing around with the click event handler here, Let's just go ahead and take one of these buttons. It doesn't make any difference which one. We'll just add a button to click event handler to this button. And when the user clicks on that button, we'll just have it go ahead and increase the value of that progress bar so we can actually see what's going on there. To do that, again, I need to go ahead and grab that progress bar that we have out there. Actually, I should be able to say progress. Yeah, progress bar P equals so this dot find by name. We'll call this progress bar 1. And then we'll just say p.value equals p.value plus 10. So that's going to increase the value of the value that we assign to the progress bar by 10. Because the default values ranges from 0 to 100, that's going to allow me to have a range of, basically it'll jump up 10 times as I go through and click this. We'll go ahead and run that again. Only this time, we'll just click on that bottom button that gets displayed. And here's the progress bar, and as I click on that, you can see that jumps up by 10% every time I click that. And again, the other controls still work, and the click me button still displays the dialog box. So there I have, different types of routing events going to the different types of controls. And I can do, pretty much whatever I want to as I'm doing that. Okay, pop back over to here. Getting a lot of questions in here. Okay. Ted's asking, does XAML automatically create partial class instead of a regular class? And the answer to that is yes. It has to, because the XAML is a partial class. There's a code behind. Now, you don't necessarily have to have the code behind, but the code, you can actually do embedded code. For example, you could embed your code inside a C data tag. However, it's still going to need to have a class behind it. It gets compiled into a class, so it always uses partial. Why do I have to add event handlers in XAML? Well, in this case, and then the follow-up question is it because it is still CTP? And the answer to that is yes. If I was using the designer, I could actually double-click on it and get to the code behind it, but I'm just adding it manually. Everything you see me doing today is to get you used to the idea of XAML. Basically, C# does the same thing, but the IDE wires it up behind the scenes. Think of this as just using, we could use Notepad to do the exact same thing. Tom's asking, how do these HTML controls work on other OSs like Linux or Macs? And the answer to that is they don't, because these are not HTML controls. These are WPF-based. And because they are WPF-based, these do not work on other operating systems unless they implement the .NET framework, which most of them don't, obviously. However, once we move to WPF-E, these controls will work in that. But we are not talking about WPF-E right now. We're talking about WPF, which is a Windows-only scenario, requires the .NET 3.0 framework. Is there a way to avoid the cut and paste if you intend to deploy the application both on Windows and as a web? And Bob, that's a great question. The answer to that is yes. You can drop the entire page, or the entire UI inside a control, user control, if you will, and then place a single user control in a page object or a window object, or simply ignore the top level object, page and window, and then whatever it's actually rendered in will actually, it'll take over that. Are there any plans to use WPF on mobile devices? Not WPF, but WPF-E, which is, again, is an entirely different thing. It's more like, if you're familiar with the way Flash works, it's more in that scenario. So it's going to be a self-contained style application in that case. Is it possible to add the button in code to be at the top of the stack panel? Hank, that's a great question, and the answer is yes. It's simply an order in which I add them to that. So, for example, if you're familiar with Windows and ASP.NET today, we have pre-render and post-render events. In that scenario, we would simply be moving it to the pre-render portion of it, where you would actually stick it in before the actual control gets created, and then. If you're used to controls, you can actually, the base.render method. Do you do it before or after that? So what are the main advantages of both versions of WPF? What are the main advantages of both versions? I'm not, Andre, extend on that because there aren't both versions. There's only one version right now. Will a WPF web project work in Firefox if you aren't using WPFE? If no, what version of IE will support WPF web projects? Actually, Glenn, that is a great question. And the answer to that is WPF web projects will work in Firefox given the correct configuration of Firefox. We're not talking about WPFE here. We're talking about WPF running on Windows requires the .NET framework. But as long as the application is Firefox or whatever the browser, whatever the application is configured correctly for the XAML documents, then it should be able to render just fine inside those. And the follow-up question is, what versions of IE will support WPF web projects? That would be IE 7 or greater. It might be IE 6. So Andre's asking, why should I move from HTML to WPF? Because of the power that you can get out of it. The graphics capabilities are way beyond anything that you can do inside of HTML. Okay, let's get back over here and let's talk about some of the things that you can't do with HTML that you can do with WPF. Talk about look and feel of an application. Now, everything you've seen so far is very, very rudimentary. And in fact, everything you're going to see today is going to be relatively rudimentary. But there are a lot of functionality exposed to you that you simply can't get access to through any other platform. The typical things like sizing and width and setting margins and padding, that's stuff that HTML can do. You know, this isn't anything new. The same thing with positioning, where we define the alignment and things like that. There are some things, though, that allow us to start changing the way the applications work when it comes to things like flow direction. You're going to see me do a nice little change to the application, and it's going to surprise you some of the things that it does. And because all of the applications are well aware of what's going on inside of you know, how Windows is configured and things like that, that we don't take into account when we're actually building the applications, but you know, things like flow direction really depends on the language you're coming from. So being able to set this and understand what's going on without having to redesign your application, if you will, is some amazing power. The last portion of the look and feel that we're going to talk about today is what we call transforming. And this is where we actually do different types of transforms on our objects inside of WPF. And these transforms do some very interesting things. They allow us to get access to functionality that just simply wasn't available in the past. So let me just go ahead and pop into this since we only have a few minutes left in the webcast and get into it and show you what it is I'm talking about. So here I'm going to pop back over. I'm going to add one more control to this, by the way. I forgot to add this. It was in my demo code, so I'm going to go ahead and add it. I'm going to add an ink canvas control. And this ink canvas control is basically what we call a canvas. It's a blank slate. It allows us to put anything we want to in it. But in this case, I'm actually going to add an image control inside of that. In the image, I'm going to go ahead and set some height properties on it and a width property. And my tab key really tabbed over pretty far there. And then we'll go ahead and set a source for this image. And the source is actually going to come, it's a little project I've been working on in the spare time. Go to my images / MT Sky 4. .jpg. So what I've got here is a control that's inside what we call an ink canvas. Now any control that I add to inside this ink canvas is going to become ink enabled immediately. And what I mean by ink enabled is when I go ahead and run this, now I'm currently not running on a tablet PC, but because I have the ink enabled in this particular image, what it's actually going to do is it's automatically going to enable inking from my mouse support. So here it's actually loading my application, and what it's going to do is it's going out to my web server, and it's gone out and it's grabbed this little picture of this airplane that I've been designing. You can see it's actually an air design. It comes apart. The wings and tail come off of it and becomes a little trike, if you will, a motorcycle-based design. But you'll notice that my cursor, as I move over the image, actually becomes a dot. Because I can do things like point at the fact that there's no propeller on this plane, yet there's supposed to be one there. That's because of the unique design of this aircraft. It has a folding prop. Also point out to the way that the spars actually hook up here. They drop into little slots right here. So there's some interesting things going on in this, and that's because I've enabled this. Now you'll notice that I'm actually I'm in my browser. So in this web browser here, I'm able to do kinds of things that we typically aren't used to seeing in the past. And again, as we look in here, all of the other controls continue to work just fine. So that's something that I want to point out. That's an interesting type of control that it allows us to add other types of controls to it. So the last thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and make some changes to this very first button that we had here. And this button right here, real simple thing. We can do some nice little attribute changes, like for example, change the background. Let's just set the background to blue. And we can also set the foreground while we're at it to white. And now when I go ahead and run this, my button is going to have an entirely different look. This is the kinds of things that you're used to doing with standard HTML-based items. So setting the colors, nothing new. Just want to show that you can do that. And there you can see my big blue Click Me button. And when I click me, I get the You Click Me result. Now, some of the things that you can also do, for example, is change the height and the width. We've seen that, so I'm not going to do anything new there. But what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to take this Click Me text. I'm going to remove that. I'm actually going to set that as a content tag inside there. Oops, that's not what I wanted. Click Me. And now I'm going to actually add additional features to this. The feature that I'm going to add is what we call a button.render transform. Now what this is going to do is it's going to allow me to actually start transforming this button in ways that we haven't thought of in the past. For example, I can actually tell this button to go ahead and rotate using what we call the rotate transform. And I'm going to rotate it by some angle, say 45 degrees. And then I'll go ahead and close that tag out. Once I close that tag out, and by the way, you can see IntelliSense has figured out that everything looks good. If I go ahead and save this and now run it, what I'm going to get is a button rotated at 45 degrees. And I can do this with pretty much any type of control that we have out there. Now this button, because I specified the height and the width, is actually rotated beyond the text box or the ink canvas below that. Because I rendered it before I rendered this one, it's actually getting overwritten by that. If I wanted to, I could actually turn transparency on. But in this case, you can see the button actually still works. So when I click it, I actually get the Click Me functionality. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and close this down. I'm going to go ahead and change a few of the attributes here. So we have a height and the width of 300. Let's make this 100. Make that 100. So this is going to be a perfect rectangle. I'm going to set my text block to have a height of 100 as well. Make this 125. And because I have my stack panel here, I'm going to add one more attribute to my stack panel that's actually going to tell this to go ahead and align this to the left side. So we're going to align the items in the stack panel here to the left side, which is going to do something interesting. Because the button and the text block are going to be able to fit side by side, it's actually going to start flowing those right next to each other. And I can add one more attribute here, flow direction, that says left to right or right to left. In US, we just use the default left to right, so I'm just going to use that. Go ahead and rerun this control here. Remember, my button is rotated at 45 degrees. And because I'm using the stack panel, but I have a flow layout condition turned on, now we can see the Hello World text is over the top of the button. The button is rotated 45 degrees. And when I click on it, I still get all of the functionality that I expect. You know, the imagery updates, the clicking functionality. But this is just some basic functionality that you really can't get inside of any other types of basically HTML stuff without actually generating a lot of images. Now we can take this a step further and add one more thing. By the way, this is going to be the last portion of it. So if you're anxious, we're going to create what we call a transform group, because normally we only do one transform at a time. In this case, I'm actually going to group them together and do multiple transforms. And you can see here that we have several different types of transforms. I can scale it, I can skew it, I can translate it. Translate it means I'm going to move it. Let's just choose a skew, and we'll choose angle X, and we'll set that to 45 degrees. Let's see what kind of output we get by doing that. Again, run the code. So running this code should give us the desired effect of not only did we rotate it, but we also skewed it at an angle. So we have the vertical sides, 45-degree rotation, and this button still works. Now, as you can see, we have a lot of control over what we do with these controls. If I wanted to, I could apply those exact same transformations to every single one of these controls without any hesitation whatsoever. I would have no problem doing any of that. So as we've seen here, we introduced you to the .NET 3.0 framework. We talked about the 4 pillars. We talked about what XAML is, and we looked at the differences between the window versus the page, and we saw that there really aren't any. It's really just the defined container of our application. We looked at the 4 various types of controls that we had, whether that be the content control or the controls that contain items, which we call item controls. We saw the text and inking controls as well as the range style controls. And then we finished it up with just a really brief introduction about the power that you can get by playing around with the look and feel. We haven't even touched on things like themes and styles, but if you want to learn about that, I highly encourage you to go out and take a look at that. There's also a great book by Adam Nathan called Windows Presentation Foundation Unleashed. Unfortunately, I don't really have any more details on the book. I know I've got the book, I just don't have it with me. And it is a fantastic resource for learning about WPF. Next week, we're going to be learning about SQL Server 2005 specifically and how we can actually utilize that within C#. We're going to take a look at things like data binding and actually how we can get access to the data within SQL Server from our code. And that's going to lead us up into, allow us to get a lot more business functionality out of our applications, if you will. The week after that, by the way, we're going to be talking about game development. And then the last one is we're going to finish it up with a look at how you actually deploy these applications. I do want to thank you. Again, here's my contact information. I do want to point out, if you've seen in the past, I do have a new manager. Sam Henry is my new manager, and he'd love to get your feedback on this webcast or any of the other webcasts that we do. samhenry@microsoft.com is his email address. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Tracy, where she can get you into the survey, and I'll be taking a look at the demo slides, or the questions, and answering them while you're filling out the survey. Trace?
Excellent. Thanks, Bill. And remember, for more information, everyone can print a PDF of today's session. And in order to do that, just go to the File menu in your upper navigation bar. Like Bill said, we're going to get to the remaining questions here in just a moment. Please feel free to submit them into the questions and answers pane found at the bottom of your live meeting screen. Also, I'm going to be posting a survey here in just a minute. If you'd all please take a moment to fill it out before you log off. We do appreciate your feedback. As a reminder, for upcoming and previously recorded webcasts, you can visit Microsoft.com/webcast. You can go here to access this webcast, which will be available in about 24 hours. Also, if you have any webcast content ideas, if there's something out there that you'd like to see and haven't yet, you'll want to follow this link here. And for anybody who's interested in receiving a free 14-day trial of Microsoft Office live meeting, you'll want to visit Microsoft.com/presentlive. And now for filling out that survey today, you're going to be automatically entered in to win this 30-gigabyte Zune digital media player. So it gives you a little incentive to fill that out for us today. And here is the survey. Please follow the links provided to complete today's webcast evaluation. And Bill, I do see some questions waiting there for you.
Yep, got a few of them in here. Bryce is asking, please name, what is the name of that book and the title of it again? The book is called Windows Presentation Foundation Unleashed. And the author is Adam Nathan. And if I remember correctly, I believe it is a Sam's publication book. It's orange. It's a bright orange book, so that leads me to believe it's Sam's. My blog address is blogs.msdn.com/wsteele. And actually, I'll go ahead and post that for everybody to see here, blogs.msdn.com/wsteele. And the book, I'll go ahead and type that in. That is Windows Presentation Foundation Unleashed, spelled correctly, L-E-A-S-H-E-D, by Adam Nathan. Post to all. And Glenn's saying that WPF Unleashed can actually be found at Amazon.com. Thank you, Glenn. And Arcade's asking, does Visual Studio SP1 contain extensions to the IDE for .NET 3.0 framework? No, it does not. You must download those separately. With WPF, can you perform a lot of GUI-rich application functions like drag and drop of objects, etc.? Yes, you can, Chris. It is very easy to do that. In fact, I highly recommend you take a look at all the functionality that you get with WPF. I mean, this session just barely scratched the surface. There's so much power inside of WPF. The ability to do rudimentary things that I would call it, dragging and dropping and things like that is just a minor set of functionality that you can do here. There's so much more that we can see. That's why I'm devoting an entire series to just what you can do with WPF. And at this point, we're actually looking at I'm not real sure exactly how many sessions it's going to be, but I would say it's probably going to be at least 20 different webcasts in that series. What should be installed on the client machine to run WPF? Very simply, the .NET 3.0 framework. That's the only requirement on there. And that kind of leads into what Dave is asking. Dave is asking, what is the presentation host.exe file? That's actually the host for your WPF-based applications when you're running them standalone. They run inside a container app. Similar to the way your applications run in the .NET 3.0 framework, that's for XP and things like that, that's actually the host that we're going to be using for that. And that is actually all the questions that I have in the queue at this point. I want to thank everybody for attending. Don't forget to stop out next week and take a look at C# and SQL Server 2005. And Glenn's saying I missed the link for the survey. I don't think we it should be up on the it should be up on your in the live meeting window there.
I'll go ahead and forward that link to him as well, Bill.
Okay. And then I guess one more question just popped up in there. Arcade's asking, what is required to develop .NET 3.0? You just need Visual Studio 2005 plus the extensions that we talked about. That's the only thing that's required. All right. I want to thank everybody for stopping out, and I will talk to you next week.
Great, and with that I do want to extend a very special thank you to Bill for your presentation today and answering all the questions we had come through the queue. And also a big thank you to the attendees for joining us today. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this will conclude today's session. The audience may now disconnect from the audio portion of today's presentation.